All right, everyone, welcome back to Talking Soccer. I'm your host, Justin Horniker, and today's episode, we are going to finally relive the MLS Cup final. I let the goosebumps settle before I could really get into it. And after that, we'll kind of roll into the start of the offseason. Of course, with the handing out of the cup, it started the official 2023 offseason. MLS teams are starting to make roster moves, starting to finalize some of the options that are eligible for next season, and starting to look ahead to the St. Louis City SC expansion draft on Friday. But let's get through this MLS Cup final first, and then we'll go into the fun roster stuff. So, of course, this year's 2022 MLS Cup final was the number one seed in the West, LAFC, against the number one seed in the East, the Philadelphia Union. Union and LAFC, of course, tied on points for the Supporter Shield in the regular season, but LAFC had more goals for, thus winning the Shield, making sure that when they come head-to-head in the final, LAFC get to host at the Banc of California Stadium, which, atmosphere-wise, was just off the charts. This was probably the loudest I've ever heard a MLS Cup final. Maybe not. I think of the Real Salt Lake Sporting Kansas City game where it was snowing. That game had some pretty crazy atmosphere as well. The double dink game, if you remember, that one also went to pens, and Real Salt Lake hit both posts that would have won for them, but we don't need to go into that now. Sorry, Salt Lake fans, I apologize. I know you weren't ready to catch a stray there, but atmosphere-wise, another penalty kick game, so maybe that has something to do with it. And eventually, LAFC are handed the trophy. But let's get into this game a little bit. Let's talk about our takeaways and ultimately what this means for LAFC and what this means for the Union. So, LAFC and the Union come to this game, and at first it really felt like two teams trying to feel each other out. And ultimately, most of the game was kind of like this. If you look at the underlying stats, and although it was a pretty high-scoring game, both teams were about 1-1 XG-wise. So you wouldn't have expected many goals in normal circumstances. That probably checks out. Both these teams throughout the regular season, throughout the playoffs, have been very defensively sound. Even though they can score in bunches, they've also been strong in their own end and taking care of the ball. That's kind of both teams want possession, both teams want to dictate. And even though they can both attack on the counter as well, they want to dictate the game on their terms. And that's when the first goal comes in the 28th minute after this kind of period of feeling out that Kellyn Acosta puts a ball in. 1-0 in the 28th minute. It'll stay that way heading into the half, but it didn't really feel like LAFC had control of the game necessarily. It definitely felt like the Union were still in this. It definitely felt like another goal was coming at any point. Daniel Gazdag then in the 59th minute, so 15 minutes into the second half, puts the Union on the board with an assist from Jose Martinez to make it 1-1. Then you have Jesus Murillo really starting to steer the train off the tracks. At this point, in the 83rd minute, it's 1-1. This felt like the clincher for LAFC. This felt like this was the title-winning goal. We would be remembering Jesus Murillo as the real champion of this game, the MVP of this game. But by the end of this, we don't really remember this goal at all. So that makes it 2-1 in the 83rd minute. The 84th minute, Paxton Aronson comes on for the Union, taking off Jack McGlynn, who had kind of a so-so game. And I think that sub was kind of a crucial moment for this game as well, especially because 1 minute later, Jack Elliott scores his first goal of the game, his first of two goals, not to be too much of a spoiler, assisted by Kai Wagner. And we are now even in the 85th minute. Both teams kind of playing for stoppage time at that point, playing for extra time. And we would get extra time. Some subs made by LAFC, Christian Tella for Kellyn Acosta to start off the extra time period. And then Gareth Bale for Carlos Vela in the 97th minute. So we'll go into the second period of extra time, still tied 2-2. Gareth Bale in the game. And honestly, that's where the difference is in these two teams, along those margins where you can take a former MVP in Carlos Vela and you can swap him out for a former Galactico in Gareth Bale. that's where you see the difference. Even though Gareth Bale hasn't been 100% the difference maker for LAFC this year, he hasn't necessarily had the impact that you would have maybe expected from him. He makes the impact in this game, and big players show up in big moments, and that's what Gareth Bale did. This very moment is why you make the Gareth Bale signing. But before we can get there, Maxime Crepeau off a poorly weighted back pass. So they send it back to Crepeau. It does not reach him at all. Crepeau has to really, make up some ground, run out of the box, and dive for the ball. Fortunately, he does not get there first. The attacker gets there first. He takes out the attacker, but also in the act of diving for the ball, he breaks his leg. They don't show the replay. Obviously, he has to get carted off, and you really didn't know what the injury was at first, but later on, you find out that he has a broken leg, broken tibia, I believe, and he was able to FaceTime from the hospital, if not a little bit loopy after the game. So, good news is that he's safe in that aspect. He has a broken leg that I'm sure will take a lot of time to rehab, so that'll be interesting in the offseason for LAFC. But for now, John McCarthy comes in to replace him. Backup goalie, LAFC down to 10 men, onto a backup goalie. It's not looking great. John McCarthy, of course, you've all heard the story by now. Philadelphia kid, homegrown contract for the Union, played for the Rochester Rhinos. So, man after my heart. The pre-MLS Next Pro Rochester team, by the way. Rochester Rhinos, that's another story for another day. Almost made it to the MLS. We're on the verge of being an MLS team, but we're an independent team that has just loads and loads of American soccer history. So anyway, I don't need to go on that tirade, but it's in the video. Jack Elliott in the 4th minute of stoppage time in the 2nd period of extra time scores his 2nd goal of the game, putting the Union up 3-2 and taking all of the air out of the bank. You could hear a pin drop after this Jack Elliott goal, but fortunately for everyone in LA, fortunately for LAFC, Gareth Bale off of Diego Palacio assist. And this is a nice little ball sent into the mixer. Gale's able to just have some great movement on his run and get on the end of it. Put it in the back of the net. 3-3 all. Gareth Bale's the hero. And that's the final kick of this game to send it into penalty kicks. 3-3 going into penalty kicks with a backup keeper. And what would you know, John McCarthy stops every single one of the Philadelphia Union shots. LAFC end up winning this game off a final pen by Ilie Sanchez, which has to feel good for Ilie too. Ilie not re-signed by Sporting KC this past year. He was kind of the stalwart, the rock that held the Sporting KC midfield together for almost a decade. To not be re-signed had to feel hard done by him, but LAFC pick him up. They make him a crucial member of their midfield this year, and Ilie is one of those players where he's just a solid MLS performer. He's a solid MLS midfielder. He's not great at any one thing, but he's good at a lot of things. He's calm under pressure, and he's good at controlling the midfield. And in MLS, that can be a little bit rare, especially in a player that hasn't necessarily wanted to go overseas. He's from the Barcelona Academy, came stateside, and hasn't really wanted to move away from the MLS, and is still just a solid contributor. And it's great to see him kind of get that punctuation point by clinching the game. Ultimately, John McCarthy is your MVP, stopping every shot in the penalty kick. It's one of those stories that only a sports final can give you, that only soccer in this country can give you. Someone coming from the lower leagues coming up for a big moment like this. It gives me goosebumps just talking about it. But that is it for the MLS season. Let's move on to the off season and talk about what is coming up. So with that chaos still hanging in the air, the haze from the 52-50 still, I think it's lofting to Kansas City at this point, still hanging in the air. But out of that carnage comes roster moves and anticipation for Friday's expansion draft. So let's talk about what this little offseason window looks like before the expansion draft and before the rest of the offseason. So today, tomorrow, so Tuesday and Wednesday, so that is November 7th through 9th, MLS teams will have the opportunity to either decide what they're going to do with their roster. So players have options, if they're going to decline or accept those options, if they plan on negotiating with the player to make that outreach, they have an option to re-sign them during this window, or if not, they still have their rights for restricted free agents. You know the deal. Out-of-contract players are now out of contract, but for the purposes of the expansion draft, they're still owned by that team. So say, getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, if St. Louis City were to pick Aaron Long, they would get first negotiating rights with Aaron Long since he's out of contract, and if they aren't able to sign him, they get compensatory allocation money. So that's kind of how that goes. That being said, rosters are frozen on Wednesday. Expansion protection lists are due on Thursday. So Thursday afternoon, I'll try to come up with a little video because by that point, that's when the list should drop. So I'm going to kind of go through that, get an idea of who's being protected, get an idea of what free agents are out there and what City can kind of strengthen through the expansion draft. But let's get into it. Ahead of Friday's expansion, what do we make of this STL City SC roster so far? What do we make of the roster moves they made so far? And who are some free agents they can maybe be looking at? So for those of you who don't know, it's been announced a couple of little acquisitions. They acquired Jared Stroud for $100,000 of allocation money from Austin FC. Stroud is a pretty decent MLS step pickup. He's not going to win you games necessarily, but you can't have too much MLS depth. Stroud played for Red Bull New York, so Bradley Carnell, the coach of St. Louis City SC, is very familiar, and at least he's familiar with the Red Bull style, that style of offense that St. Louis City is going to be operating, or at least they'd have with every other team in their academy and with City 2 last year. They've also acquired 21-year-old midfielder Aziel Jackson for $150,000 from Minnesota FC. Jackson was Minnesota FC 2's MVP last year and definitely lit up St. Louis City 2 quite a few times, or at least, looked like the best player on that field by a long shot. Minnesota fans are not happy to see Jackson go, which for me as a City fan, obviously that's good news, and someone with a lot of upside that you only give up $150,000 in allocation money for, definitely getting good value there. That's the thing with the expansion draft is pick someone up in the expansion draft, you are only getting $50,000 in allocation money in compensatory for your pick that you just lost, for your player that you just lost. Now, players under 25 on their entry level contracts are still protected, so you don't even have to, they don't count to your list of 10 protected players. But something to keep in mind if you have a player that you're not sure you're going to be able to re-sign, or you have a player that, I don't know the rationale Minnesota had for giving up on Aziel Jackson, who is, by all accounts, a very promising young player, but that's an option, I guess. Maybe that gets you a little bit of a guarantee that you're not going to have another player picked in the draft. We saw this with the NHL expansion draft sometimes, and I think you saw that with Charlotte last year too. Trades can sometimes mean like a little bit of a handshake. Don't pick my player. So that could be what's going on here as well. So like I said, we'll know all players on Thursday, but the current STL City SC roster looks like this. Goalkeeper, Roman Berkey. We'll talk about that here in a second. Defenders, center back Kyle Hebert, Joakim Nilsson, Josh Yaro, and wingback Selmir Pedro. So that's a position that they're definitely going to have to strengthen. Midfielders, on winger you have Isaac Jensen, Thomas Ostrak, and Jared Stroud. And then central mid you had Edouard Lewin. And then forward you have João Klaus, of course, their designated player. Designated players João Klaus and Edouard Lewin. So central midfield and striker, that's where you want to have some DPs. And you look at that and you instantly see some holes, right? There are definitely some areas there that they could strengthen. Joakim Nilsson is a great center back pickup. Signed him on a free. Transfer mark value is $3 million. He has played in Europe. He played in the Bundesliga. So that's a good center back option. But outside of that, Josh Arl, Kyle Hebert, they look good at City too, but they aren't proven MLS center backs. And we've seen in expansion teams in the past that you absolutely need that. Selmir Pedro has a lot of upside as well, but again, hasn't had a ton of first team minutes, even at FK Sarajevo. So that's something to keep an eye on, although he looked spectacular last year and is definitely there to make a difference in the MLS. But they're still missing another wingback. Now, they do have options in the academy that I'll make a separate video down the line because there's a lot to go into there for how long this video is going to end up being. You look at that, STL City definitely want to acquire another forward. They definitely need some help in the defense and would probably welcome something in central mid as well. You keep in mind that they have a designated player slot open and a U23 designated player spot open. You save those for the summer. That's when you're going to kind of find your best deals, especially outside of the league. You look at what Austin FC did with Sebastian Drusi. They brought him in the summer, and although they definitely floundered early on in the season, they were better for it in the second half and ultimately second seed in the West this year. So let's look at some of the out-of-contract players that STL City could, potentially pick up either before or after the expansion draft. USMNT defender and fan favorite everywhere, Aaron Long, is currently out of contract with Red Bull New York. That's one that speaks to me of, if he isn't going to Europe, which I wouldn't expect him to, Bradley Carnell is very familiar with Aaron Long with his time at New York Red Bulls, and Lutz Pfannenstiel, St. Louis City, the whole organization has shown that they like players who have experience in either specifically the Red Bulls or Red Bulls type offense. Now, let's not go into taking every player that used to play for the Red Bulls. We know how that works out, but having a central back midfield, Joakim Nilsson and Aaron Long, that's pretty good for a first-year team. There's also AJ De La Garza, Daniel Henry, and Florian Youngworth, who are available out of contract as well. You look midfielder, former Sporting Kansas City player Jimmy Madronda. He hasn't resigned yet with Seattle and is, by all accounts, available. Derek Etienne Jr., in midfield as well, had just re-signed with Columbus. There have been talks there, but that's another player who's currently out of contract. And look at forwards, you have St. Louis native Will Bruin is available. That's one that I could absolutely see happen. And Indiana Vasilev, you might remember him, former Aston Villa prospect, is available too. So there's some options there in out of contracts. I don't know if any of them would be interested. Will Bruin is certainly interesting because someone, getting up there in years, especially in terms of MLS forwards, come home for a final year if he's thinking about getting out soon. Or, just come back to St. Louis, come home. That's always... And plus, St. Louis just loves their hometown guys. And having one of those come back for the opening roster, that's just too fairy tale to not happen. And, of course, the Aaron Long shout is just because of familiarity. I don't want to speak that into existence. I'm going to get some hate on that, but it could happen. All right. So as constructed, you can absolutely tell that I'm not that sold on this team. But there's a lot you can do in the expansion draft and the entry draft and, subsequent to the start of the season via trade. This front office have shown that they are not afraid to take some risks, especially in paying Roman Berkey to come over. So they're paying him over twice the amount of Eloy Room and Andre Blake, which is not ideal when you're the top paid goalkeeper by double. They could have definitely used that $800,000 elsewhere, but honestly, it's $800,000. It's a contract. It came over on a free. I'm not that worried about it. Will it look bad if he doesn't have the numbers? Yes, absolutely. But for a guy who's a proven Bundesliga keeper, has played important Champions League minutes, I'm not that worried about it as much as other pundits may be. And that's kind of the crux of it, right? St. Louis City don't have a ton of money to spend. They aren't high spenders, but they have been able to pull some deals that make you kind of raise your eyebrows. They're here, they have connections. Now, does that translate to MLS success? We've seen ways that they haven't. Say, look at Cincinnati, look at Nashville's first year. It's depends on, what lessons have they learned from past expansion teams and what lessons have that. I think we'll find out on Friday and beyond. So, thank you all so much for watching. Subscribe to my channel if you want to see those expansion picks on Thursday. And give me a thumbs up if you like this video, if you learned something, if you picked up something from it. Let me know what you thought of LAFC winning their first MLS Cup title. And we'll talk soon, folks.